Hello again, my AP Econers. We're here to talk about macro Unit 1 review. Again, this is the first unit we did in macro. Like I said, in theory, if we were starting with macro or if we were only doing macro, what we did for Unit 1 in micro, I would have done first scarcity, production possibilities, curves, comparative absolute advantage, things along those lines. So this is the first stuff. It's not really the first stuff for macro, but we've already covered that in micro. So at any rate, the first stuff we covered, some simple things, mostly dealing with GDP. GDP is the big concept for this unit and understanding that, but also understanding just various parts of the economy, such as the circular flow, inflation, the business cycle, and unemployment. So a lot of kind of leading economic indicators that we're talking about here, things that you're hearing about right now, right? As far as what our economy is going through with the COVID thing. And so you're hearing about us being in a recession. That has to do with GDP. You're probably hearing about unemployment. Okay, you're hearing about a lot of these things that prices, deflation, perhaps things that are affecting us as we speak. And so a lot of these things should be familiar to you. One of the most basic models of macro is our circular flow diagram. Again, we've talked about this before. Really, what you need to know about this is that the idea that money and resources flow in opposite directions. Okay, that's the biggest thing. And so essentially, households, they go to markets like Walmart and Kroger and Amazon, could be online markets, whatnot. And what do? We give them our money, and in exchange we get groceries, and if you can find it, toilet paper and things like that, right? So the stores, the Walmarts and whatnot, they send money to firms like General Mills. General Mills sends the cereal to Walmart for sale and so forth. So basically, this idea that money is flowing in one direction, goods and services are flowing in the opposite direction between the households and the markets and whatever else. And so that's the big thing you need to know. Every once in a while, you'll see a question about my least favorite word in the English language, leakage. We've talked about that. I'm not a big fan of the word leakage, but savings and imports are usually the best examples of what they call leakage. Leakage meaning the money leaves the circular flow. When people save money, when they put it under the mattress or wherever, it kind of leaves the circular flow for the moment. And if we import things, we send money to other countries, and that leaves it as well. And so they might ask a question about that, but 90% of the time, if you just know that money flows in the opposite direction of goods and services, you're usually good to go. But the big thing, let's talk about GDP. Okay, so GDP is, to kind of give a definition, one of my favorite definitions, it measures the total value of new finished goods and services produced in a particular country. Whatever country you're trying to measure. Could be America, could be Japan, could be Brazil, could be Italy, whatever country you're measuring. It has to be made in that country. Okay, that's key. Doesn't matter who makes it, it just has to be made in that country. Okay, new finished goods and services produced in that country. So, some things that, again, you don't necessarily need to memorize this list, but will help you wrap your minds around what's included here. So what's not included, raw materials, because they're not new finished goods and services. Again, we only want to count the product once. If we count it every step along the way, we're counting it multiple times, and things are going to be overvalued. And so the end product, when it's sold to the consumer the last time, it in theory encompasses all the costs that were incurred earlier. Resales, we're just trying to figure out what we made, okay? The new things that we made. A resale, something that's a used car or something you find at a garage sale. These things are not new, so we don't include that. Domestic companies operating overseas. So if America has a shoe factory operating in Thailand, that shoe factory, what they're producing does not get included in America's GDP. It was not made on our soil. Self-work not included because there's no paper trail and there's no way of knowing exactly what that is worth. So if you mow your own lawn or cut your own hair, these things are not included in that. Stock and bond capitalization, that's a fancy way of saying making money off the sale of stocks and bonds. That's not included. Nothing new is made directly by that transaction. And then, of course, illegal goods because, again, there's less likely, there's not much chance of there being a paper trail there. So, bottom line is GDP is made up of 4 components, C, IG, G, and XN. What do they stand for? C is consumption. That's pretty simple. You buy a new car, You buy a hamburger, you buy new pair of shoes, whatever, that goes under consumption. Any purchase, you get a haircut, you get legal advice from a lawyer, investing advice from a stockbroker. These are all examples of products or services that you have consumed. That's pretty simple. IG stands for Gross Private Domestic Investment, and usually this encompasses three things, okay? They can sometimes break this down between these three, so make sure you know these. Number one, all new construction, including new homes, okay? So any kind of new construction is going to be included in that: factories, homes, apartment buildings, things like that. Capital purchases, so a factory buys a brand new machine to help make something, that's going to go in under gross private domestic investment. And this is the tricky one: changes in inventories. The idea, remember, is we want to include products in GDP in the year they were made, okay? So let's say that a car is produced in the year 2019, but does not sell until 2020. Well, remember, we want to include it in 2019's GDP because that's when it was made. Here's the problem. That's not going to show up under consumption because the car was not bought in 2019. It was made, but it was not bought. So it's not going to show up in consumption. What will show up is for Ford or whoever, they're going to have a +1 in their inventory compared to the year before. They made a car this year that didn't sell, their inventory increased by 1, so we want to include that in GDP. Now, what happens the next year in 2020 when they sell it? Well, here's the problem. Originally, it shows up under consumption because it was bought in 2020, so it's going to look like it was purchased, but then we want to subtract it out because we want to show that, no, it was not made in 2020, it was only purchased, and so that's where we subtract it out. That's where you get the changes in inventories. That can be a little bit tricky, but hopefully that makes sense. Government spending, when the government provides national defense, when they build a new highway, when they build a new school, when they build whatever, we want to include these things. These things are good. They benefit us as citizens of this country. So it includes government spending on goods and services. Does not include transfer payments, taking money from one group and giving to another group. That in and of itself is not included because nothing new is purchased by that. But spending on goods and services will be. And then XN, which is net exports, okay, very important. Exports minus imports is what we mean by net exports. Exports minus imports. Now remember, we make a product here. It gets sold to France. We want to include that in our GDP because it was made here. Again, like changes in inventories, it's not going to show up in our consumption because France bought it. Okay, so it's not showing up here, but we want it to show up. So here's where we do it. Down in net exports, we include the exports because that's something that was made here, okay? On the other hand, something that we imported, again, we get whatever tea from England, that will show up under consumption. But we don't want it to be in our GDP because we didn't make the tea, England made the tea, so that's why we subtract out the imports to get rid of it from consumption, okay? So that ensures that we are including things made here, whether or not they were bought here, and we don't include things that were made in another country. So you got to figure exports minus imports. That's important. All right, so that's the 4 components of GDP. Now, calculating GDP. Occasionally, they might give you a chart similar to this one that you see here. And in a chart like this, they're going to have examples of the various things that we make. For example, eggs, bacon, and toast. How many we made, and the price they sell. Now, 2 types of GDP, nominal and real. Nominal is simply whatever the value is of GDP in that year's dollars. Okay, so it's just the total of everything purchased in that year's dollars. And so that's pretty simple. To find out nominal GDP, you just take the quantity, multiply it by the price of that item, and then you add it all up, right? So in this case, 2018, I got the math here for you. But 10 times 2, 20 times 5, 30 times 1, okay, add all that up, and it should equal $150, okay? So $150 is what you got there. In 2019, we simply do the same thing. 20 times 250, 20 times 8, 40 times 1, add it all up, and our nominal GDP is 250. Now, that looks like our economy increased pretty drastically from one year to the next. But in order to factor out inflation, because the question is, did we actually make more things, or did prices just go up, right? Because think about this, if we make the same number of things, but prices are double, it's going to look like our GDP is twice as big. Now, are we really twice as big? No, it's just that inflation has caused it to be higher than it should be. So, to factor out inflation, we find real GDP. Using a chart like this is pretty simple. You take the quantity of each item produced and you multiply it by the base year prices. That way we can compare apples to oranges. Okay, I'm sorry, apples to apples, not apples to oranges. So, multiply it by base year prices. Now, here's the trick. I tell you that 2018 is our base year. Now, naturally, real GDP is going to be the same as nominal in the base year because you're multiplying the same quantities by the same prices. What's going to change, though, is 2019, okay? Because now you're going to take 2019 quantities times base year prices. So now you have 20 times 2, 20 times 5, 40 times 1. Add all that up, and it should equal 180. And again, I have the math down here for you to show that. That gives us a better sense of how much have we grown? Yes. Not quite as drastically as it may have appeared with nominal, though. So, give you a chart like this, that's the easiest way of figuring out nominal and real. Again, nominal is that year's quantity times that year's prices. Real is that year's quantity times base year prices. Okay, remember that, and usually you keep that straight. All right. Now, another concept that we need to know is what's called the GDP deflator. Okay, the formula for the GDP deflator is the deflator is equal to nominal GDP divided by real GDP and then times 100. Remember the way I always remember that? I always think nominal numerator. Okay, now real doesn't sound anything like denominator, so don't worry about that. But when you get to the exam and you're like, oh my gosh, which one is over which? I just remember nominal numerator. That sounds pretty similar to me. So, the GDP deflator, this is one of the methods we use for calculating or accounting for inflation from year to year. Okay, now the deflator, since remember what we said a moment ago, nominal and real in the base year are going to be the same thing. So based on the numbers we just did, in the base year it'd be 150 divided by 150. Well, that's going to be 1. 1 times 100 is always 100. So in the base year, GDP deflator is always 100. Since nominal and real are the same. Okay. Other than that, though, you see the formula here. Notice there are 3 variables. You got the deflator, you got nominal, and you got real. They're going to ask you a question, and they're going to give you 2 of the 3 of those, and you have to solve for the third one. Okay. Just use a little bit of algebra depending on what they give you. Sometimes they give you nominal and real, and they ask what's the deflator. Sometimes they give you the deflator and nominal, and they say what's real. Sometimes they give you real and deflator and they say, what's our nominal GDP? So they're just going to use a little bit of math there, but know the formula. If you know the formula, okay, and you math it out, you're going to be good to go. All right, now how do we use the deflator to measure inflation? Our formula is pretty simple. Okay, you take the deflator in year 2 minus the deflator in year 1, divide it by the deflator in year 1, and then multiply by 100. Okay, now, that being said, this is very relevant if you're comparing 2 non-base years, okay? If you're comparing to the base year, it's a very simple process. It's actually just the deflator in whatever year you're measuring minus 100. Why is that? What is the deflator in year 1? I'm sorry, in the base year, it's always set to 100, right? So imagine this is 100. Okay, now, if you divide this by 100 and then multiply by 100, guess what? They cancel out, right? So now we're left with the deflator in year 2. Let's say the deflator is 150. Okay, so now you're just left with 150 minus 100, and of course equals 50, and so inflation is 50%. Okay, so if they could ask you to compare to the base year, easiest thing in the world. Basically just take the deflator and subtract 100, and you have your inflation rate. 2 non-base years, like I said, this is a little bit more relevant, okay, because the numbers are not going to be 100. So, let's say that, like in this example here, they're comparing the deflator in 2010, which is 150, and 2011, which is 180. Well, now you have 180 minus 150 divided by 150, and then times 100. So you just math this out. This simplifies to 30 divided by 150, and I show the math down here. 30 divided by 150 is 0.2. 0.2 times 100 is 20%. Okay, so that's a little bit easier, a little more relevant to use this formula if you're comparing two non-base years. And the good news is when we look at the CPI and you're comparing inflation, it's the same formula. Year 2 minus year 1 divided by year 1 and then times 100. So that's nice and neat. All right, let's look at CPI, which is next. So CPI stands for Consumer Price Index. Again, it's another means of measuring inflation. What the CPI does is it takes this quote-unquote market basket of goods, okay? Various things that pretty much every household purchases on a regular basis, and it simply asks the question, what was the price of that basket in 2019, and what was the price of that basket in 2020? And that will tell you overall what's happened to price level changes in the economy. Now again, some prices may have gone up, some may have gone down, so we're generalizing for the entire economy when we do this. Okay, so economists track the changes from year to year. Now, compared to the deflator, economists prefer the CPI method because the CPI method can include foreign goods. Okay, and of course, as Americans, we don't just buy American goods, we also buy foreign goods, right? So that would make sense that we would want to include those. Whereas the GDP deflator, well, if you're talking about GDP, we're only talking about what? Goods made in this country. We don't just buy goods made in this country, so it's a little bit less relevant. But anyway, so they're going to give you, they may give you the market basket, the items and the prices, and basically, just like we did up here, it's going to be kind of the same process. They're going to tell you, here's what the market basket consists of, here's the quantity, here's the prices, you add it up, and that kind of tells you what the CPI is. But what they're probably more likely to do is give you two CPIs, and again, it's pretty much the same formula. Inflation is the CPI in year 2, or this one's labeled current CPI, minus the initial or year 1, divided by year 1, and then times 100. Okay, so same process again. If they said the CPI was 180 in this particular year minus 150 divided by 150, okay, and then times 100. Okay, actually this says current CPI. I copied this formula. This should say initial CPI or year 1. Okay, so that's incorrect. I will make that change on the sheet. But anyway, so do the same process and it would equal 30%. Okay. And then lastly, real quick, a couple people helped and hurt by inflation. Those helped by inflation, borrowers. Borrowers love inflation because you borrow money and then you pay back money that is less valuable than what you originally borrowed. That's a good deal for you, right? You like that. Hurt by inflation, you've got savers. I save money. Now I get it out to spend it. It doesn't buy as much as when I originally saved it. Bad news for me. Obviously, lenders, if borrowers like inflation, lenders don't like inflation because I lent you money, and when you paid me back, you're paying back money that's less valuable, that buys fewer things. And of course, if someone lives on a fixed income, say you have a pension, you get $2,000 a month, every month for the rest of your life in retirement, every year that inflation goes up, that $2,000 buys you a little bit less than it did the year before. So inflation, you would not like that. If they asked about deflation, of course, it'd be the exact opposite. Borrowers don't like deflation. Savers, lenders, people on fixed incomes, they do generally like deflation. Their money becomes more valuable. All right, let's look at, this is a pretty simple concept, the business cycle, just a different way of measuring the ups and downs in our economy. When the economy is growing like this, and you can see based on GDP, if GDP is expanding, that's what we call our expansion phase. At some point we top out in that cycle, and that's called our peak, and we go into contraction, or what's usually called recession. Recession does have an official definition, and that is 2 consecutive quarters of declining GDP. If we go 6 straight months, GDP is going down, we're in an official recession. Okay, so 2 straight months, 2 straight quarters, of declining GDP is recession. At some point we hit our bottom, and that's our trough, and then we come back up with our expansion phase and so forth. Now this line, sometimes you'll see this here, this represents our full employment output. For those that are familiar with what we're going to do in later units, our long-run aggregate supply curve is kind of another way of saying that, right? So this is what we could produce if we are at full employment. Well, sometimes we're beyond full employment, and sometimes we are below full employment and so forth, and that's when we go into recession and expansion and all that kind of stuff. So that's pretty simple stuff. And then lastly, just unemployment, how to calculate it, and then the types of unemployment. Okay, it's important. So the unemployment rate, percentage of people in the labor force, that's important, percentage of people in the labor force that do not have a job. Okay, that do not have a job. So first of all, we have to know what our labor force consists of. Labor force is anyone 16 years old or older who has a job, who is currently employed, or is actively looking for a job. Now remember, if you don't have a job but you don't want a job, you are not unemployed. Okay, you're a full-time college student, retired person, stay-at-home mom or dad, people, those are not unemployed. Okay, you have to be actively looking for a job to be considered unemployed. So we take that, then our formula is pretty simple. The number of unemployed people divided by the labor force and then multiplied by 100 to give us a whole number. So again, example, let's say our labor force consists of 100 people. 93 of those 100 have a job. 7 do not have a job. Remember, these 7 people are going to be actively looking for work. They want a job, they cannot get one. Okay, so 7 people unemployed, and so you simply do 7 divided by 100, which would be 0.07, multiply it by 100 to get it to a whole number, and we have, of course, 7%. Okay, so pretty simple, but that's how you do the math. And then the 3 types of unemployment. Okay, you have 3 types: frictional, very common type of unemployment. It's where people are between jobs or people are looking for their first job. You're always going to have this in a society. You always have some people transitioning from one job to the next, and of course you always have young people setting out, graduating college, or looking for their very first job. So that's pretty natural, and we're going to see that in a second. Structural, that's where there is a mismatch between the jobs and the workers and their skills. So you have jobs available, you have workers who want jobs, but the skills needed are not lining up. Okay, they're clashing. And so that's structural unemployment, and that especially happens during times of economic growth and transition, all right, because maybe new jobs are being created, but we're still kind of entrenched in the old way of doing things, and workers have not yet acquired those skills needed for those jobs. And so that's kind of a natural thing as well, as we'll see in a second. The kind we don't like is cyclical. I always remember cyclical is when our economy is sick. Okay, so sick is cyclical. That's unemployment as a result of a recession. Okay, we don't like that kind. Now, there's no such thing as a 0% unemployment rate in economy. Never going to have a 0% unemployment rate. Okay, so full employment is when we only have frictional and structural. As long as those are the only kinds of unemployment we have, we are considered fully employed. Even if that means a 5%, 6%, 4% unemployment rate, that's fine. Generally speaking, people who want jobs are getting jobs. Some people are going to be between jobs, or there might be that mismatch, but that's always going to happen, and it's unavoidable. So that's considered natural or full employment, or you may see a fancy word, NIRU, occasionally, but anyway, that's full employment. If we have cyclical, that's when we are not fully employed. That's when things are bad and we're in a recession. Okay, so we don't like the cyclical. If we just have frictional and structural, whatever that may be, we are considered fully employed, okay, or the natural rate of unemployment. All right, so there's unemployment. All right, so that's our first unit, just kind of the basics of some ways of measuring things in the economy, health and well-being, and all that kind of stuff. As always, if you have any questions, let me know, and until next time.